Imagine standing on the deck of the most powerful battleship in history. It is September 2nd, 1945, and the air in Tokyo Bay is thick with the weight of a world finally coming to rest. Thousands of sailors in crisp white uniforms line the railings of the USS Missouri. General Douglas MacArthur steps to the microphone, his voice echoing across the water. Behind him stands a man who looks like a ghost. His uniform hangs loosely over a frame that seems held together by nothing but sheer will. His cheeks are hollow, his eyes are deep in their sockets, and his skin is pulled tight over bone. This man is Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright. Just 3 years ago, the newspapers called him a failure. They called him the man who lost the Philippines. He was the commander who presided over the largest surrender of American forces in history. But here he is, standing on the very deck, where the Japanese Empire is about to sign its unconditional surrender. To understand how a man goes from the lowest point in American military history to this moment of ultimate vindication, you have to look past the medals and the uniforms. You have to go back to a jungle where 80,000 men were starving, forgotten, and waiting for ships that were never going to arrive. The nightmare began just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. While the world was focused on the tragedy in Hawaii, the Japanese Air Force was systematically dismantling the American presence in the Philippines. In a single afternoon, MacArthur lost half of his Air Force. The B-17 bombers were caught like sitting ducks on the runways of Clark Field. Within days, tens of thousands of Japanese combat troops were pouring onto the beaches. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and suddenly they were without any protection from the sky. MacArthur ordered a strategic retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. The plan was simple on paper: dig in, hold the line, and wait for the massive American fleet to arrive with reinforcements. The men believed it. They had to. If they didn't believe the ships were coming, the hunger and the heat would have broken them in a week. But in the quiet halls of Washington, the decision had already been made. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall knew the cold mathematics of global conflict. It was Europe first. The Pacific would have to wait. The 80,000 men on Bataan were, for all intents and purposes, expendable. No one told the soldiers, and into this desperate gap stepped Major General Jonathan Wainwright. He was a West Point man, a cavalry officer of the old school. He was lean, leathery, and tall, which earned him the nickname Skinny. It wasn't a term of disrespect, it was a badge of honor. While other high-ranking officers directed the war from the safety of fortified tunnels on Corregidor Island, Wainwright lived in the dirt. He was a front-line commander who walked the trenches before the sun came up. He sat with men who hadn't eaten a real meal in a month and listened to their stories. The situation on Bataan was a tragedy born of chaos. During the retreat, massive stockpiles of food and rice had been left behind. By the first week of January 1942, the men were already on half rations. This wasn't a diet, it was a slow process of starvation. They ate monkey meat, snake, and iguana. Eventually, Wainwright had to give the order that broke his cavalryman's heart: the slaughter of the horses. These were animals the men had trained with and cared for, but in the end, they were the only thing keeping the soldiers alive. Every night, the psychological warfare began. Japanese radio stations would broadcast directly into the American lines. They didn't play marches or propaganda speeches. They played a haunting song titled, "I'm Waiting for Ships That Never Come In." It was a cruel reminder of the reality the men tried to ignore. The horizon stayed empty day after day. The ships were not coming. The men were alone in the jungle, fighting a ghost war that the rest of the world seemed to have moved past. In March 1942, the situation took a dramatic turn. President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and head to Australia to lead the counteroffensive. MacArthur summoned Wainwright to the Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor. In the dim light, MacArthur told him he was leaving. He promised Wainwright that if he was still holding Bataan when he returned, he would make him a lieutenant general. Wainwright looked him in the eye and said, "I'll be on Bataan if I'm still alive." MacArthur escaped under the cover of darkness on a patrol torpedo boat. When he reached Australia, he gave his famous "I shall return" speech. But back on the peninsula, the men felt the sting of abandonment. Wainwright was now in command of a lost cause. He sent a cable to Washington stating clearly that his men would be starved into submission if food did not arrive by mid-April. Washington received the message. They did not reply. There was no food to send. To understand the defense of Bataan, you have to understand what it does to a human body to fight on 1,000 calories a day in 95-degree heat. The men lost 20, 30, even 40 pounds. Their muscles wasted away. Then came the diseases. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi swept through the camps. Without quinine, the fevers never stopped. Surgeons operated by flashlight in the middle of the jungle, often without enough anesthesia. Yet the line held. They held because they saw skinny Wainwright walking among them, his own body withering away just like theirs. On April 3rd, the Japanese launched their final massive assault. They had fresh troops and heavy artillery. The Americans had nothing left but empty magazines and hollow stomachs. On April 9th, the commander on the ground, General Edward King, realized that any further resistance would simply be a massacre. Without Wainwright's permission, he surrendered Bataan. It was a crushing blow. 75,000 men were marched into captivity, a journey that would become the infamous Bataan Death March. But the cork in the bottle remained. Wainwright was still on the tiny island of Corregidor, a 2-square-mile rock in the mouth of Manila Bay. As long as he held that rock, the Japanese could not use the harbor. For nearly a month, every Japanese gun on the mainland was trained on Corregidor. The men lived in the Malinta Tunnel, breathing recycled air that smelled of blood, sweat, and antiseptic. The walls shook constantly from the bombardment. Dust fell like snow from the ceiling. On May 1st, Wainwright sent a message to the president. He didn't ask for a miracle. He simply stated that the limit of human endurance had been passed. On May 5th, the Japanese began their amphibious landing. Despite being near death from starvation, the defenders fought with a ferocity that stunned the Japanese. The first wave of invaders was nearly wiped out, but the Japanese had an endless supply of men, and Wainwright had none. By the morning of May 6th, Japanese tanks were moving toward the tunnel entrance, where thousands of wounded men and nurses were huddled. Wainwright made the hardest decision a soldier can make. He surrendered Corregidor to stop the killing. He knew how the world would see it. He knew the shame that would be attached to his name. But he refused to let his men be slaughtered for a symbolic gesture. Before the surrender was finalized, the Americans burned their flags and smashed their equipment. Wainwright watched the colors of his country turn to ash, knowing he was stepping into a darkness from which he might never emerge. For the next 3 years and 3 months, Jonathan Wainwright was a prisoner of the Japanese. He was moved from the Philippines to Taiwan, and finally to a cold, desolate camp in Manchuria. As the highest-ranking American POW, he was a trophy, but he was treated with no dignity. He stood in the same lines and ate the same watery soup as the privates. He used a cane to walk, a gift from MacArthur before the war, which now served as his only support. In the camp, Wainwright became a symbol of survival. He insisted on military discipline. He made the men stand at attention. He kept the rituals of the Army alive in a place designed to strip men of their humanity. He didn't know about the victory at Midway. He didn't know about the Marines at Guadalcanal. He didn't know the tide of the war had turned. He only knew that as long as he was standing, the United States had not been defeated. While he was suffering in silence, his sacrifice was doing something incredible for the war effort. The Japanese had planned to conquer the Philippines in 50 days. Because of Wainwright and his battling bastards, it took 150 days. Those extra 100 days were the most important 100 days of the war. It gave the U.S. Navy time to crack the Japanese codes. It gave the shipyards in America time to churn out new carriers. It bought the time needed to win the Battle of Midway. The suffering on Bataan was the currency used to buy the ultimate victory in the Pacific. In August 1945, the end came suddenly. Soviet troops liberated the camp in Manchuria. When the American officers found Wainwright, they were horrified by his appearance. He was a skeleton. But when he was told the war was over and that MacArthur wanted him in Japan for the surrender ceremony, he stood as straight as his cane would allow. He was flown to Yokohama, where he met MacArthur at the new Grand Hotel. When MacArthur saw his old friend, he was speechless. He reached out and embraced the man who had been through hell on his behalf. 2 days later, Wainwright stood on the deck of the Missouri. When it came time for MacArthur to sign the surrender documents, he used 6 different pens. He turned around and handed the first pen to Wainwright. It was the ultimate gesture of respect. The man who had been forced to sign a surrender in a dark tunnel was now holding the pen that ended the empire that had imprisoned him. A few days later, Wainwright returned to a hero's welcome in the United States. President Truman pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest in the Rose Garden. The general who lost the Philippines was now the most beloved soldier in the country. He had survived the impossible, not through strength of arms, but through strength of soul. He had stayed with his men when he could have left. He had suffered with them when he could have sought privilege. Jonathan Wainwright passed away in 1953, exactly 8 years to the day after the surrender on the Missouri. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery among the heroes of the nation. But his true monument isn't in a cemetery. It's in the 100 days he bought for the world. It's in the stories of the men who came home from those camps because their general refused to give up on them. Today, the voices of those who fought on Bataan and Corregidor are fading. There are very few left who remember the smell of the jungle or the sound of that Japanese radio song. We owe it to them to remember that victory isn't always about who fires the last shot. Sometimes, victory is about who refuses to stop standing. It's about the man who stayed when everyone else was leaving. If you have a father, a grandfather, or a great-grandfather who served in the Pacific, whether they were in the Army, Navy, Marines, or the Army Air Corps, please share their name in the comments. Tell us where they served and what unit they were with. These stories are the foundation of our history, and they only live as long as we continue to tell them. Let's make sure the names of the men who gave everything in the Pacific are never forgotten. They bought our freedom with their time, their health, and their lives. The least we can do is remember who they were.